Hello, history class, and welcome to our Modern Muslim Empires PowerPoint review. Starting us off, PowerPoint question number 1. Despite being slaves, why do you think the Janissaries held such a high position in the Ottoman Empire? And how was this type of slavery different than the kind we have studied in Africa and the New World? To answer this question, I think you really have to begin by looking at the purpose of the slaves in this point in time. As opposed to the Americas, where the primary purpose was for agricultural work, for manual labor, and quite frankly for doing a lot of jobs that European Americans didn't want to do, the Janissaries' primary purpose was to be soldiers, to be an elite fighting force for the empire, as well as to be trained officials within the court. So both soldiers and government officials, just within society in general, have a much higher social status than agricultural workers, which means that even though they were essentially slaves in the fact that they couldn't choose to just go off and do whatever else they wanted, a lot of times these Janissaries held much more prestige and higher positions within the Ottoman Empire than a lot of the average Ottoman citizens would have held. So something very counterintuitive to what we'd oftentimes think of as slavery and how slavery operates. Also, towards the purpose of this, you have to think that part of the purpose of the Janissaries, particularly being recruited or captured, or kind of a tribute system from Christian families within Eastern Europe, was the fact that this was kind of a way to secure loyalty of those Christians, knowing that they essentially had their children. But at the same point in time, even though they were essentially kind of stealing their children from them or forcing them to hand them over, they would have known that their children were essentially going to be taken care of, that they weren't going to be, brutalized. They weren't going to be working in the same kind of slave system that you saw in the Americas, that they were essentially going to be achieving probably a higher status and higher position in life than their parents were going to have, which likely would have led to a less likely chance of rebellion and pushback against this system. I would say another key aspect you have to look at is that the Janissary system was not hereditary. The fact that the Janissaries really were not allowed to form families and so forth made it so that there were very few children, and those children were not then automatically put in a separate class, as you see happening within the Americas, where essentially once slavery becomes hereditary within the enslaved African American population of the New World, that's really when it becomes very standardized and institutionalized, and can go on from generation to another, which, as we were talking about a few weeks ago, is one of the things that really made the slave system in the Americas atypical. Also, that's lacking a certain racial component. Even though the children were coming from a different cultural group, essentially a different religious group, there wasn't this sense of them being as different as you saw occurring with imported enslaved individuals from Africa within the New World and European culture, where there was such a vast difference between the two, or at least a perceived difference with the Europeans, made it very easy to identify who those enslaved individuals were, and the kind of racial justifications that very quickly crept up to justify the abuse that enslaved individuals were being subjected to. Very different with the Janissaries, where there was essentially some amount of cultural difference, but very quickly those children were going to be indoctrinated into the Islamic faith, indoctrinated into essentially their jobs and roles within the Ottoman society, and there wasn't going to be nearly as big of a cultural difference that we see, which is another reason why there was likely much different treatment between these various groups. But something very interesting to think about, the various ways that slavery can, take form across time and through history. Obviously, these are oftentimes very, very brutal and repressive forms of slavery. Even a form like the Janissaries is certainly not without its complications as we would see them today, but certainly very seemingly different than what we think of occurring within the Americas at this point in time. I would like you to draw, paint, or graphically design 3 symbols A mark, sign, or image that indicates, signifies, or is understood as representing an idea, object, or relationship that represents our three early modern Islamic dynasties, the Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal Empire. I would then like you to explain how and why each symbol is a representation of its dynasty. And once more, just like the sort of film pitch ideas, I thought there was a lot of really good diversity in the types of symbols that I was seeing the class design for this question. Some of the symbols focused on individuals, portraying important individuals for one of the dynasties, like Suleiman the Magnificent or Babur for the Mughals. Some of them focused more on kind of symboling Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal fashion or how they dressed. Some of the symbols were more focused on sort of religious iconography, for example, the crescent moon for Islam. More specifically, designs around Twelver Shi'ism for the Safavid Empire, or ideas of trying to sort of represent the divine faith that Akbar was trying to bring in to sort of the Islamic and Hindu setting in India. Also, there are lots of symbols of military strength present in all three. Of course, guns, or for like the gunpowder empires, that factored into some of the symbols that I was seeing. Some of the symbols were also more representative of economic strength. For example, the trade through the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean trade networks. Things that you might be exporting a lot of, like the Persian rugs coming from the Safavid Empire, or things that they were importing and utilizing, like coffee and coffee shops in the Ottoman Empire. And there was also, sort of important cultural symbols as well, particularly in architecture. People putting the Blue Mosque for a representation of the Ottoman Empire, or the Taj Mahal as a representation of the Mughal Empire. So, once more, a lot of different ways that people sort of took the information material from this semester, or from this section, and brought it into their answers and into their sort of visual imagery, which I thought was very well done. I would like you to draw, paint, or graphically design three symbols, a mark, sign, or image that indicates, signifies, or is understood as representing an idea, object, or relationship that represents our three early modern Islamic dynasties, the Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal Empire. I would then like you to explain how and why each symbol is a representation of its dynasty. And once more, just like the sort of film pitch ideas, I thought there was a lot of really good diversity in the types of symbols that I was seeing the class design for this question. Some of the symbols focused on individuals, portraying important individuals for one of the dynasties, like Suleiman the Magnificent or Babur for the Mughals. Some of them focused more on kind of symboling Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal fashion or how they dressed. Some of the symbols were more focused on sort of religious iconography, for example, the crescent moon for Islam. More specifically, designs around Twelver Shi'ism for the Safavid Empire, or ideas of trying to sort of represent the divine faith that Akbar was trying to bring in to sort of the Islamic and Hindu setting in India. Also, there are lots of symbols of military strength present in all three. Of course, guns, or for like the gunpowder empires, that factored into some of the symbols that I was seeing. Some of the symbols were also more representative of economic strength. For example, the trade through the Silk Road or the Indian Ocean trade networks. Things that you might be exporting a lot of, like the Persian rugs coming from the Safavid Empire, or things that they were importing and utilizing, like coffee and coffee shops in the Ottoman Empire. And there was also, sort of important cultural symbols as well, particularly in architecture. People putting the Blue Mosque for a representation of the Ottoman Empire, or the Taj Mahal as a representation of the Mughal Empire. So, once more, a lot of different ways that people sort of took the information material from this semester, or from this section, and brought it into their answers and into their sort of visual imagery, which I thought was very well done. What was the Enlightenment? Why were its ideas revolutionary? And how does the Enlightenment still impact us today? A lot of you did a good job sort of tying the beginnings of the Enlightenment back to the idea of sort of the development of the new science, right? How scientists like Galileo and Copernicus were using observation combined with sort of reason and mathematics to try to sort of identify the natural laws of the world. That was, of course, picked up by future scientists like Francis Bacon and, of course, Isaac Newton. And really sort of that attempt to try to use those methods to understand our natural surroundings um, was a hugely sort of popular theme across Europe at this point in time. But certainly your explanation of the Enlightenment had to go farther than that. It wasn't just revolved around the science, and really sort of that early aspect of new science, while it helped lead to the Enlightenment, it wasn't the Enlightenment itself. Really, the Enlightenment focuses on the time period, which is a little bit later, when people started then sort of taking that idea of finding and discovering the natural laws of science and instead decided we can take those same ideas and try to find those natural laws, but we're going to do it by looking at humans and humanity and how people interact. So trying to look at sort of the human condition and find the natural laws that should govern humanity. You can really sort of think of this as the beginning of kind of the social sciences in its very earliest forms, of just trying to take a look at how do how do humans organize themselves? How do they behave? Why do they behave in this way? So trying to sort of find those natural laws that either do or should govern humanity becomes a huge part of the Enlightenment. And what this ultimately ends up leading to is a huge sort of questioning of tradition within Europe, particularly looking at the traditional role of government, which had, of course, primarily been based around strong monarchies, as well as a critique of religion, which of course had, first of all, sort of been dominated very much by the Catholic faith, but since that time period had really devolved into a lot of conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and in a lot of these countries, there had been war and bloodshed, and really a lot of negative consequences, persecutions, and so forth, based around people's religion. So really sort of questioning how legitimate religion really was, how legitimate these governing systems, these monarchies actually were, and trying to say maybe that there are laws that exist that make these other more sort of traditional interpretations of sort of the power structures in Europe either irrelevant or incorrect. Maybe there's a different way to go about doing things. So, for example, one of the big elements that comes around in the Enlightenment, one of its main aspects, is the idea of sort of individual rights, that people have sort of individual rights that should be observed, that should not be violated, that everyone should have sort of these things that they can always rely on or count on in how they're going to be treated by other individuals and societies. Now, certainly it was not holistic and was not being applied to everyone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, but if you talk about someone like John Locke and coming up with his ideas that everyone has the right to life, liberty, to owning and having property, that those were the sort of basic ideas of what he found as those natural rights. This is natural law that says all humans have a certain amount of rights. That very much dovetailed into sort of political rights, that the government sort of had its role, but the government should be working essentially for the people, not the people working for the government. Is kind of where the ideas of John Locke very much started to come in. And so the idea of representation becomes very, very important, right? That a government shouldn't just be composed of a king telling everyone what to do. It should be essentially built up by the consensus of the people that it is governing. Also, religious tolerance is another key hallmark of the Enlightenment. The fact that there was so much tension between religion, between the various religions, both Protestants and Catholics, but also between Christians and Jewish populations within Europe, Christians and the Islamic empires. This was, of course, after the wars we talked about last time with the Ottoman Empire. So really looking at a much more sort of serious critique of religion and how it functions as part of the Enlightenment as well, and sort of the various Enlightenment thinkers come down on various sides of this. Some people still think that religion is still very sort of real, and even though some people might not be behaving themselves in the best way, that it's still something that should be used for sort of the foundation and basis of knowledge, whereas other people were completely willing to throw it out, saying, no, religions are just made up by people and human beings. They're just tools for people to use to get what they want. And really, this is the first time in Europe that you start seeing that sort of harsh of a critique of religion in general, and very much was influential from this time period moving forward as more and more people start sort of questioning the legitimacy of sort of religions in general. Just the idea of sort of the accumulation of knowledge is also very important. Remember Diderot and the creation of this encyclopedias, trying to sort of collect all of human knowledge and putting one source. Diderot had been a big fan of Wikipedia. I think that's sort of what he sort of had in mind. Maybe not entirely, maybe a little more peer reviewed, but certainly you would have think that these early Enlightenment figures would have loved the access to knowledge that's available in our modern day time and age here, and just that idea of that knowledge is something that should be sought after and accumulated and preserved was maybe not 100% new, but very much heightened during this time period. Also, the basic sort of idea that using reason and critical thinking was very, very important, and that sort of everyone should be doing that, and that is how you should sort of be making the choices in your decisions in life, not just doing what the government says, not just doing what the religion says, not just doing what anyone says, but sort of making your own thoughts or having your own ideas on matters, using your own critical thinking to say, what is it that I want to be doing, what is it that I should be doing. Somebody also brought up the idea of deism, and that definitely shows the shift in religion during the time of the Enlightenment. How a lot of Enlightenment thinkers still tried to sort of combine ideas of some sort of religion, because they didn't. It seemed like a lot of them weren't quite willing to completely abandon the idea of there being a God or a creator, but they took it in a very sort of abject sense. Just basic tenets of deism was that sort of God had created the universe, and then he stepped back and was not really getting involved. He wasn't super close, didn't really care what human beings were doing, but he did develop these sort of natural laws which governed the universe, and that's what the deists thought that they were trying to discover. They sort of were getting access to God by discovering these sort of natural laws. So the idea of natural rights that they thought would have sort of come down through sort of a divine way that people are getting these rights, but that it wasn't something that sort of a God was sitting right there looking at you, sort of determining, is this something you deserve or you don't. As I mentioned earlier, the Enlightenment, though, certainly had its limits. On the one hand, it certainly was the beginning of the way people were beginning to think about humans and how they should be treated and what roles that they should be playing and how societies are constructed. But at the same point in time, primarily, most of the Enlightenment thinkers, not all of them, but most of them, were white men, and a lot of times their main concern was their rights and their freedoms and their ability to engage in this process. And for most of them, it did not occur to them that these rights should also pertain to other individuals. So, for example, women, for a large part, were left out of the Enlightenment. Not totally, and certainly I would say, first real push towards women's rights occurs during the Enlightenment, and you're going to see evidence of that for example, in the French Revolution. But for the most part, it wasn't going to be the main priority of taking those people who were sort of not already on the top of the social hierarchy and trying to sort of rearrange society based on that. Racism and slavery are going to work the same way. There are plenty of people who ascribed to the ideas of the Enlightenment, but still thought that slavery was perfectly justifiable, and still would have fallen into ideas of which we would very much consider today to be sort of a racist ideology. But it's important to note that these were sort of the beginnings of these ideas, and just like you could sort of say Martin Luther opened Pandora's box when he sort of left religion, or brought sort of the Catholic religion open to interpretation, and that's why you had sort of all these splinterings into various Protestant religions. A very similar process here happens with the Enlightenment, because when certain people start sort of claiming these rights for themselves and start saying that these are natural rights that all men possess, it doesn't take long for those ideas to be picked up by other people. For women to start saying, well, what about all women? Why don't we say these are rights that all people possess? It starts, people from all races, all religions, all ethnicities, eventually, as time goes on, are going to be picking up on these ideas and broadening them to a level much farther than the sort of original interpreters of these ideas would have thought of them or perceived them. So why are these such a big idea? Why are they so revolutionary? Well, first of all, it was a real challenge to traditional European power structures. Most of the political power and authority in Europe was coming through two channels, primarily up until this point in time. It was the monarchies and it was the church or religion. And the Enlightenment is going to be criticizing and sort of poking holes and questioning both of those to a large degree. We'll be talking about a little bit more about sort of how these more conservative elements of European culture react a little bit later here. But it's important to note that that was certainly a big change and a big sort of revolutionary shift. You can also see the impact on what's eventually going to be some very influential revolutions and shakeups in sort of the world's politics. For example, the American Revolution is going to be very much based upon the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of John Locke, right? The words of John Locke are very much sort of taken and used in the Declaration of Independence. Ideas of sort of Adam Smith and economics are going to be used partially to justify sort of the economic arguments for the revolution. These are all going to be examples of very much sort of how these ideas are going to become revolutionary during their own time. And they're very much going to be still impactful with us today. I would say, most of the ideas of sort of modern day human rights are going to be dated back to this time period. The sort of importance of individuality and sort of individual reasoning, it's a general sort of reliance upon science, knowledge, and reason. Once more, not everyone perhaps is very good at that, and there's certainly a lot of debate about what qualifies and what does not. But the idea that that's sort of what you should be doing very much is tied back to this time period. But I think very much, if you're going to be talking about sort of a lot of the modern sensibilities we have surrounding rights and government and so forth, certainly are going to be coming from the Enlightenment. And as I mentioned, while they didn't necessarily have all the answers at the time, and there were a lot of limitations to who they wanted to apply these to, as time went on, it's going to be applied to a broader and broader group of people. And people are saying, well, we want to make this ideal a reality. And working towards that, I think, is where, in a lot of ways, you see sort of the modern day movements for rights and justice that we see up until today. Compare and contrast the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. What similarities do you see with how these revolutions played out? What were their differences? Well, to begin with, three of these revolutions were based on ideas of the Enlightenment. You can tell it sort of very strongly in their declarations of independence, in the governing documents that they are eventually going to write, the constitutions, that they are very much going to be, after this revolutionary time period, trying to use the language of the Enlightenment to sort of justify these revolutions and to conceptualize sort of the new countries and the new nations that they are going to be creating. So ideas of universal rights to life, liberty, and happiness very much present in each of them. A certain amount of equality, at least among sort of people of the same status, depending on which revolution you are talking about. So these are all going to be sort of similarities that you are seeing. And essentially all three are going to be based upon the idea of the importance of self-determination by people. In the case of course, the British colonies wanting self-determination from Great Britain to become the United States of America. In France, it was essentially the people wanting self-determination away from the monarchy, saying the people should be making the decisions for France, not the monarchs. And in the case of Haiti, it was, of course, enslaved individuals saying we want the self-determination essentially over our own lives, and trying to take that power away from both people who had been sort of their yeah, controllers or overseers or owners, or those who were trying to prop them up and keep them in power. So very much the sort of self-determination of the majority of the people are what is going to be the sort of driving factor in these three. So how do they differ? The American Revolution, you can really very much look at it as more of a top-down revolution. It was actually a fairly conservative revolution in general. If you notice the sort of disconnect that began between the British and the American colonies, it was very economic based, right? That the idea that the British wanted to tax the colonies was very, very offensive to the colonists. And partially this is because the colonists, particularly the ones who were sort of leading the revolution, oftentimes were of the sort of upper echelons of society. It wasn't slaves leading this revolution. It wasn't, poor laborers leading this revolution. No, the leaders of the American Revolution were lawyers. They were doctors. They were plantation owners. They were merchants. These were the people who led the American Revolution, and primarily, they were increasingly finding the economic policies of Great Britain to be, like I said, very problematic. At the same point in time, though, there was a real feeling of disrespect. These were the people who felt that they were at the top of their society and that they deserved sort of the same level and caliber of respect as like the British nobility did. The British nobility did not have to pay taxes, so when eventually they started being forced to pay taxes by the British government, they were saying this is the government trying to treat us like we are servants, like we are slaves, which of course a lot of people pointed out was very hypocritical because the same people who were saying this oftentimes were the same people who, owned actual slaves. So they certainly knew what inequality was all about, and they were perfectly fine with it as long as they weren't the ones who were on the wrong end of it. And as soon as they felt like someone was starting to impinge on what they perceived of as their rights, they were more than willing to then fight against that power, and that power ended up being the British. Of course, the revolution is eventually successful. The colonists who are fighting back, the revolutionaries, are very big underdogs in the fight, but through some very good generalship by George Washington, through the French joining in and trying to sort of stick it to the British, after their setbacks in the Seven Years' War, this all culminates with eventually the revolutionaries being victorious and being able to sort of set up their own nation. It's important to note, though, that the American Revolution was really there was no shakeup of the social order. The people who were essentially on the top in the colonies at the beginning of the revolution are the exact same people who are on the top at the end of the revolution, and they start forming a new country that's going to be very beneficial to them. And there's a lot of people in the United States who were not overly, or whose interests were not very well served by this. The British government was the main force keeping more colonization back from American Indian lands. So after the United States wins the revolution, there's really an all-out assault on the lands controlled by American Indians as the United States starts expanding further and further into the continent. Enslaved individuals, there's lots of evidence that slavery was much closer to being abolished, and actually was abolished much sooner in Great Britain than it was in what was going to be the United States. So very much, if you're talking about an enslaved individual, they really did not see much benefit at all in the American Revolution, and really weren't going to see any benefits, and for many years down the line, until eventually there's a reckoning with the institution of slavery around the time period of the Civil War. So there's certainly a clear sort of contrast of those who sort of benefited from the revolution and those who didn't. The French Revolution, on the other hand, was much more of a social revolution. It was a revolution against that sort of upper elite class, the monarchy, the nobility, the clergy, with the entire idea of trying to destroy that idea of the three estates, right? The two estates, one estate sort of being the monarchy and the nobility, the other state being sort of the religion and the church, and that they controlled the vast majority of power and wealth and land within France. And then the third estate was made up of everyone else, the vast majority of the people. And the French Revolution was really about that third estate rising up and sort of wanting their own self-determination, their own rights. Once more, the Enlightenment was very, very prevalent within France. Voltaire, for example, Diderot. These are all examples of sort of leaders of the Enlightenment who had been French. Um, and so you definitely see it a different form of a revolution than you saw in the American Revolution, which was much more of a political revolution and not a social revolution. Um, Also, the French Revolution allows sort of the world to see the strength that this kind of self-determination can bring to a location, particularly the national strength that France shows when it starts fighting back against the other countries in Europe that are trying to essentially invade France and put an end to the revolution. The French Revolution, the attack on the monarchy and the nobility, of course, made all the other monarchs and nobles around Europe very, very nervous. They did not want their own populations to behave in a similar fashion, and essentially they launch a series of war against France. France, however, is able to form a very strong national army, much stronger, I would say, than their monarchical army had been previous to this, and they're able to not just defend themselves, but actually expand and push their borders, and really sort of show the strength that can be seen when there's sort of this large-scale buy-in to sort of one common ideal. Of course, the French Revolution is also going to be different because essentially throughout time it gets corrupted. People within France see the strength that France is exhibiting and is going to try to use that for their own purposes and their own agendas. This is going to lead to things like the Reign of Terror, where one political group essentially sort of uses the revolution to gain control and gain power, and then starts trying to execute all of their political rivals, and certainly makes it a much less holistic revolution, and starts trying to make it much more so that one group can take power within the country. Of course, in the long run, eventually it's going to lead to just another version of a dictatorship, as eventually Napoleon is going to take over. He's still going to be able to use this national strength, which was created through the time period of the revolution, and go on to become very close to actually conquering all of Europe. But essentially, the revolution at that point in time is all but dead. I mean, Napoleon still plays lip service to it, but from that time period going on, you have at best a constitutional monarchy, and at worst just another imperial system. So also the French Revolution, I would say, is much sort of shorter lasting than the American Revolution, but the lesson of sort of what that idea of a unified nation can do becomes incredibly relevant throughout Europe, which we'll be seeing in just a moment here. And finally, the Haitian Revolution was certainly a political and a social revolution, and is pretty much the most successful slave uprising in history, as essentially the slave population of Haiti was able to rise up to arm themselves to overthrow the people who had been controlling them, and essentially fight back against a number of European armies who were trying to take control of the island. Toussaint, the sort of leader of the revolution, was incredibly good strategist. He was able to sort of play the competing European powers, who were still essentially fighting the Napoleonic Wars at this point in time, use those powers against each other, and able to eventually get strong enough to just remove all of them from the island. And in that sense, I think you can sort of consider the Haitian Revolution the most successful for the majority of the population of all these revolutions, as the vast majority of the population who had been enslaved prior to this were going to be free and able to participate to a certain degree within the new country they were forming. Of course, Haiti is not going to be without its challenges moving forward from this time period, and part of that is because for a long while they were essentially just sort of isolated on the national stage. Countries that still owned slaves, such as the United States, didn't want anything to do with Haiti, and certainly weren't going to be cooperating or helping them in any way, shape, or form. And neither were those European countries who had been fighting to take and gain control of the island. So Haiti was going to essentially have to sort of figure it out on themselves on an island that certainly has much fewer sort of natural resources than, say, France or the continental United States. So throughout time, certainly it's going to run into struggles, but the immediate aftermath, I would say, would be primarily a much better situation for the people who were living in Haiti after the revolution than prior to it. So very interesting to see the differences and similarities between these three very important revolutions that happened around this time period, and certainly are going to have some very monumental, long-lasting impacts and effects. What do you see as some of the positive aspects to the ideology of nationalism that developed in the 1800s and still shapes our world today? And what do you see as some of nationalism's drawbacks and problems? Now, really, if you look at the world that we live in today, the development of nationalism is probably the most important aspect that determines how our world is politically organized that we live in. If you want to think of the Industrial Revolution as sort of being the main sort of development that led to how our economies are sort of organized, nationalism is very much the main way that our political systems are organized to this day. So very, very much of sort of importance when you're thinking about how and why it was developed here in the 1800s. I mean, to a lot of people today, it just sort of seems natural that this is the way the world is created. There's these individual people having self-determination in their own nations, but that was really not the case. Of course, if you remember talking earlier in the semester, primarily the world was divided up into larger multi-cultural and multi-ethnic empires, controlling large areas, maybe smaller, more independent kingdoms, but nothing like the sort of nationalistic shape that eventually was going to be built during this time period. So what are some of the reasons why it developed, and what are some of the positive aspects that people identified? Well, certainly you see a much closer relationship between government and people under nationalism. That there is this idea that certainly is an Enlightenment idea that sort of people matter within politics or within the construction of the government to some degree or another, and that people should be sort of determining the laws and the policies that direct their life. In a broader sense, sort of national unity and national identity are very much linked to this, and it can be a positive aspect. That really before this, most people's primary allegiance probably would have been to their hometown, maybe to a region, possibly to a religion. Those would have been the ways that people identified themselves. Increasingly through nationalism, people are going to start identifying themselves as an American, as a German, as an Italian. These were going to be sort of a different conceptualization in the ways that people thought of themselves. Also, the development of nationalism is going to lead to larger and more sophisticated states. Because there's more buy-in from sort of the general population, and oftentimes that will lead to sort of more obligations on the part of the government towards that population. It meant that the size and scale of governments were going to have to increase, and that the sophistication of states was going to have to be increased as well. So you see very much an increase in the ability to, for example, have infrastructure within these countries. The entire sort of infrastructure around education is very much tied to nationalism, that people wanted the ability to have sort of all people within their country receive an education and to have a basic sort of common set of knowledge for all of the people, or some people at least within their countries. Now, certainly that's not the only story behind why education was developed, and increasingly that sort of gets into the drawbacks and problems of nationalism, because one way to view nationalism is essentially a counteraction to the Enlightenment, which might seem sort of counterintuitive because certain parts of nationalism seem like it should be things like that that nationalism wanted, increased participation in government and self-determination and so forth. Essentially, what the European power structures do, the monarchs, the nobles, the aristocrats, what they're able to do is find ways to use nationalism to essentially curtail the more sort of radical elements of the Enlightenment. So finding ways to incorporate those more sort of basic elements of self-determination and participation for some people, while not terribly upsetting the social order within a country. So therefore, they are going to essentially be using propaganda, be using the idea of competition with other nations, be using the competition within a country between what they consider sort of the majority group of the nation and minority groups within the nation. They're going to be using all of these elements in order to find ways so that the majority of the wealth and power are still going to be within the hands of the same people who it was before, these reforms would have taken place. So a big part of this question is often sort of, what is a nation? And in theory, a nation is supposed to be in its sort of most pure form, one people self-determining based upon a similar or the same language, religion, history, values, and culture. The problem is, no nation is going to have that level of holisticness within it. No nation is going to only have one set of people with one language and religion and views and values and culture. Every single nation is multicultural because there are lots and lots of various people of various ideas, oftentimes various religion, various ethnic groups, all living inside the borders that one nation has sort of declared or carved out for itself. And this means that oftentimes there's going to be a lot of exclusion and hostility to anyone who doesn't nicely fit within that notion of who should be part of this nation, who should be that one people, what's the one language they should be talking, what's the one history they should be following, what are those certain values that they should be following. Anyone who sort of is outside those bounds is oftentimes going to be looked at with suspicion. They're going to be treated hostility, and oftentimes, if there's going to be trouble or problems, it is going to be that sort of upper class that is going to be using minority groups as scapegoats. That, no, we're not actually the cause of your problems. The cause of your problems are actually these other people who really aren't part of us anyways, and we should go ahead and focus on hating them and persecuting them and blaming them, rather than oftentimes looking at what the real causes of problems within the society actually were. So, for example, once nationalism becomes increased, you actually see an increase in, for example, persecution of Jewish populations and groups within these countries, where they had for a long time sort of been minorities within Christian Europe, and they had been persecuted for a long period of time. But in a lot of cases, it's only going to get worse. And of course, we can think of the sort of most extreme outcome of this being the Holocaust, and how they essentially, the German state under Adolf Hitler, decided they were going to try to eliminate and kill all the Jewish people living within their borders and the borders of the countries that they had taken over. That's very much linked to that idea of nationalism, and essentially after the First World War, and we'll get into more of this later, the Nazis trying to blame all the problems of Germany on this sort of ethnic minority, rather than essentially Germany just causing its own problems by getting into the First World War. Also, it's going to lead to the problem of a lot of hyper-competition between these nations. If the nobles and the monarchs and the aristocrats are going to be spending so much time convincing the population that they're the best people on earth, and that they're the pure people and the people with the best language and the best history and the best culture, they're going to start looking very negatively on anyone from any other country or from any other culture. And ultimately, a lot of the competition that you see developing in Europe through the 1800s into the early 1900s, really, I'd say culminating in the First World War, is based on this sort of hyper-competition that these European countries were going to ferment with this ideology of nationalism. Also, with so much more buy-in from a larger percentage of the population, you're going to see larger armies, larger military conflicts, and eventually this move towards the idea of total war, which is essentially a war isn't just between the leaders of one country and the leaders of another country. It's going to be between the populations and everyone in one country versus everyone in another country, which was really never the way war was thought of before this. It was essentially, a king or a monarch would have their army, Another king or monarch would have their private army. Essentially, they'd fight it out. But the really, the average people in the countries wouldn't have much feeling one way or another to people living in one of these other countries. There just wasn't been unless they were in the army much contact even between them. So that's sort of bringing more and more people into this sort of competition and these military conflicts. And this is also going to be exacerbated, and you can't separate it from the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution is going to make these larger armies possible. It's going to make you possible to feed larger and larger armies. It's going to make it possible to clothe larger and larger armies. It's going to make it possible to arm larger and larger armies. So the Industrial Revolution and nationalism very much are tied in hand with one another. But it's interesting to see how, there's a lot of pros and a lot of cons. And although nationalism has, for the most part, sort of won out in a global sense, I think it's fair to take a look at it and say what parts of it maybe work and what parts of it don't, and maybe is there a better way to sort of politically, construct the world than to be into these, nationalistic states, because as we've seen, there's quite a few problems that can come along with that. What do you see as the 5 most important historical aspects that made the Industrial Revolution possible? Make sure to explain why you chose each item. So yeah, I thought the class did a very good job here, choosing between a whole lot of reasons why the Industrial Revolution eventually occurs where and when it does. Of course, the revolution is essentially just the transition of production from essentially human power to machine power in some way, shape, or form, and through that the creation of mass production, so producing lots of the same thing at one time. Before the Industrial Revolution, pretty much in order to increase production of a location, the really only way to do it was to get more people, because so much of the production was based upon straight human labor. But the Industrial Revolution, while it didn't replace people with machines, it augmented people's capability and allowed them to create many more things, many more quickly, of similar style and quality and so forth. And this is going to have really a monumental impact on the way the world is going to be developing over the next 150, 200 years or so. Because the economic system really that we live in today is very much based upon the Industrial Revolution. The population levels of today, the economy that we live in, the fact that all of us go out to work at a job pretty much. Very few people are still farmers. Before the Industrial Revolution, you still probably had 80 to 90% of most populations on Earth, people were farming. After that, now, I mean, it's pretty much reversed in a lot of locations. Not all locations around the world, but quite a few locations are, completely the opposite of that. So the way we work, the way we produce our food, the way we produce our clothes, pretty much everything we use on a daily basis is all based upon the Industrial Revolution. So pretty hard to overstate its impact. Begins first in Great Britain. Primarily in the textile industry is where you really see the first foundations of the Industrial Revolution. And it begins in Great Britain for a couple of reasons. Britain already had a tradition of sort of increasing their productivity through something called the Industrious Revolution, which meant that there were a lot of people sort of working, doing handcraft trades and so forth in their own houses. Sort of cottage industries had sprung up. So there was already this sort of push to push the production of the country to its max, and people sort of working more for income and extra money than necessarily for produce and their own food. So some of the ideas that are going to be hallmarks of the Industrial Revolution are already present there. It also had a relatively stable government in Great Britain. There, had been some shakeups and revolts and civil wars, but those had been, by the late 1700s, had been finished by about more than a century at that point in time. It also had a very prevalent merchant class, which meant that there was already all sorts of trade going on. Remember, Great Britain at this point in time had a global empire, so they were already trading with the colonies in the Americas, of colonies in the Caribbean, in Asia, in India, so that there was already a system in place to export lots and lots of goods if you could produce them. Also, Britain had a very sort of large class of people who were essentially looking to earn money as laborers. The Enclosure Act is something that really led to this, as land that had previously been sort of held as communal land for villages started to be parceled up and sold to private citizens. So a lot of people who had been able to sort of squeak by and grow food for themselves in that way were no longer able to do so. And increasingly, that's going to be pushing people into towns and cities looking for work as laborers, sort of right as the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution begin, which is going to be requiring a massive amount of labor. That's one of the things that seems sort of counterintuitive about the Industrial Revolution. While there is this transition to machine labor, it actually means that the demand for labor goes way up. They need actually more people in order to do the work rather than less people. Ironically, though, it also is going to be shifting it from sort of skilled labor. Those are the people who had typically been making manufactured goods prior to this. You'd have a cobbler making shoes, or a haberdasher making hats. After this time, primarily the labor that the Industrial Revolution is looking for is cheap labor, unskilled labor, a lot of people who you don't have to pay a whole lot to. And of course, we're going to be seeing sort of the ramifications that that's going to have later on. But Britain is going to have a large population that can be used as labor. Also, geography is going to play an important part here. There's lots of navigatable rivers in Great Britain. There's lots of seaports. It also has the raw materials necessary. It's going to have coal. It's going to have steel, other metals. So kind of the just natural resources that are going to be necessary for starting the Industrial Revolution are all present in Great Britain. I already mentioned those colonies and those markets, which are going to be very important because one of the big hallmarks of the Industrial Revolution is the fact that you're able to produce so much you need to find places to export those goods to, because it doesn't matter if you can make 10,000 shirts if you only have 500 people buying them. You need to have 10,000 people to sell shirts for or to in order to make it profitable. So the colonies are going to be an excellent avenue for the British to sort of sell those products to. The first industry that's going to industrialize is really the clothing industry. So it helped that Britain sort of had this tradition of cloth making that was already sort of part of their trade repertoire, making cotton and other cloth and clothing. The Industrial Revolution is just going to very much sort of speed that up. And to a large degree, it's kind of like a Pandora's box, because once you start making machines to create this clothing faster, it's going to require more metal, so you're going to get more machines to mine better. It's going to require more transportation, so you're going to be starting with the steam engine and other more advanced transportation to sort of haul these goods from point A to point B, which is eventually going to be seen to the sort of the value of just sort of travel and transportation for people in general. And from there, it's just going to be sort of once one industry industrializes, it's going to sort of have a spreading effect on a whole bunch of other industries around it that are going to need to start supporting that industry, industrializing themselves in order to do so, because the demand is so very high. And from there, you really start seeing it just spreading across the British economy, and not too long after into the Americas as well. Particularly North America and the northern states in North America are going to be sort of the second key area in the world that is going to be picking this up, primarily because they're going to have a lot of these same advantages that Great Britain had that they're going to be able to take advantage of. There have been several examples from this week of how the process of industrialization is in part fueled by necessity driving invention and innovation. I would like to discuss an example from our world today of how this process is still ongoing. What modern technology or invention is an example of necessity driving invention and innovation? So yeah, this is a really good example of sort of how this is an ongoing process, right? How industrialization has never stopped and we're still living in an industrial age. And I thought the class did a really good job bringing up examples. A really good one I thought was the examples of cell phones. How, to begin with, cell phones were sort of the first way to talk with someone on the go, right? Before then you had to have a cord plugged into your phone and plugged into the wall, essentially. So the first cell phones were like these giant brick-looking things with an antenna coming off. It looked like some sort of military telephone or something. But as time went on, the cell phones started getting smaller because people wanted to carry them more easily And of course, they wanted longer battery life, so the batteries on them got smaller and better. So the cell phones for a while then were just shrinking and getting smaller and smaller and smaller until the early 2000s. You had these really small little flip phones that were just sort of tiny. Um, and they're very convenient because sort of fit in your pocket and not be intrusive. But then, with the advances sort of in the internet and the phones being able to do things like stream video, suddenly people realized, hey, maybe having a really tiny screen isn't a very good idea. If I want to watch a video or if I want to play a game or something like that, I'm going to want a bigger screen. So suddenly, about 2005, 2006, when the iPhone, the first smartphone, comes out, you start seeing cell phones having screen sizes getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and now suddenly you have tablets, and even some cell phones now kind of look like a piece of toast. They're so big. So it sort of shows you how the cell phone market in general has been a great example of this, and how the smartphones we have today are really the sort of demand for the qualities and the products and how those are sort of being shaped and used to meet those demands. Computers in general is another perfect example of this. How over time computers are getting faster with more memory. You can store more things. Even to run some programs, a computer that was made even 5 years before isn't going to be powerful enough or have the right technology in it. So the tech field in general is sort of has taken what had already been established, has really just sort of brought it into an even faster pace, I would say. Solar and wind power, I thought, was a good example. How people, once became a little more aware of climate change and the impact that's having, trying to shift towards different ways to use and collect energy. So wind and wind turbines, for example, the improvements in solar panels, the improvements in batteries and storing the power that is collected. Because typically with these kind of technologies, the accumulation of energy isn't the problem; it's how you store that and then sort of then use it for something. So the batteries and the capability to sort of store and transfer that power has increased. A lot of people brought up cars as a good example of this, and how cars have just sort of throughout the ages looked at the newest technology. They become faster, they become safer, and of course now they become a lot more fuel efficient as well. Once more sort of realized that that was something that people demanded and wanted to make that decision to sort of help combat climate change crisis and so forth, that sort of fuel efficiency became much higher and higher and higher on a lot of these cars, and that's still sort of an ongoing process. So yeah, I thought there were a really good way that people were sort of pick up that yes, this is still something that is happening all around us every day and is very much sort of still ongoing. What do you see as the positive aspects of industrialization? In general, how did it positively impact the locations that industrialized? What do you see as the negative aspects of industrialization, and in what ways were the locations that industrialized negatively impacted? So I thought, that the class did a good job bringing forward both the positives and negatives of industrialization. It's easy to sort of look at the world we have today and say, well, obviously it must be a great thing because we have all this nice stuff, which to a certain degree is true, but that doesn't mean that it didn't come at a cost, and it doesn't mean that there aren't still issues that are related to the process of industrialization, and because we are still living in an industrialized world, that still sort of follow us to this day. As far as the pros go, more goods and cheaper goods is kind of the top one, right? Production goes through the roof. You can produce things a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, so the price of buying things goes down. And that's why you can buy food really cheaply today, and the Crash Course video, John Green gave the example of the cheeseburger. You can buy clothing and shoes very cheaply. Back before the Industrial Revolution, it was rare for people to have more than one or maybe two pairs of shoes. Now it's rare for someone to have, two pairs or less, right? Most people are going to have quite a few. But not everyone, of course. But we're just talking about sort of the law of averages here. And it's important to note that there are still countries around the world today that are in various stages of this industrialization aspect. So this is going to be applying to places that have industrialized and are currently industrializing, no matter where they are along in this process. Industrialization also leads to larger and more complex economies. The large and much more expanded access to goods, The cheaper quality of them means that there's going to be a much higher premium put upon exchange and barter. How the your paper money and currency system, the banking system, the financial system, all of that is going to become much more complicated and much more complex and industrialized economies, and generally the economic strength of the countries that are going to industrialize are going to increase significantly, and that's going to be one of the things that's going to give these countries a advantage going into the 1800s here, is that their economies are going to sort of go soaring through the roof much faster than those countries that are sort of a little bit slower in the process of industrialization. And a lot of these countries are also going to see a growing middle class, a growing class of people who are sort of the business owners or the foremen, or people somehow making a profit off of industrialization without having to actually be working in the factories themselves. Before this time, there was typically, kind of the two or three big classes. At least within Europe, you had sort of your nobility and your royalty. You had the clergy as sort of another subset, and then you had pretty much everyone else. If you weren't a noble, even if you were sort of a merchant or a wealthy merchant, you were still sort of considered on the same class, regardless of your level of wealth. As sort of wealth and economic power become more and more important, you are going to see that sort of growth of middle class in a lot of these that are going to be very much sort of profiting and making their living off of the process of industrialization. You're going to have faster communication and transportation. Inventions, of course, like the train, the steamship, the steam engine in general, the telegraph. These are all going to be ways to communicate much faster and travel much faster than what had previously been possible. So the communication around the world is going to be increasing exponentially. How fast it takes news to get from point A to point B, which is really going to allow people to adjust the way that they react to and think about current events. Eventually the radio is going to be, of course, another big expansion in the availability of news and information and so forth. Also, industrialization is going to lead to a higher population, right? There's able to be more food produced oftentimes, and eventually once you have sort of medicines being able to be invented and becoming standardized, that's going to help with population levels. And along with higher population levels, is going to be larger standing armies that can be in the field for longer periods of time. So larger and stronger armies. The weapons are going to be increasing throughout this time. So those nations that industrialize are also going to have a huge military advantage through the 1800s. And once more, we're going to be talking in the weeks to come that there's going to be a number of locations that are going to be sort of trying to scramble to catch up to the point that those industrialized countries had reached. So those are generally the sort of pros that go along with industrialization. What are some of the cons? Well, as a lot of you pointed out, one of the big cons is that it's damaging to the environment. That it can lead to deforestation. It can lead to deterioration of environments. It can lead to potentially climate change. And it can lead to sort of all these environmental impacts that I think we're still sort of in the middle of realizing what exactly they are and how far-flung and impactful they're going to be in the future, because it's just been the last 50 years or so we've realized it's a problem. Industrialization, like I said, has been very intense for about the last 150 years, so we're not really quite sure if the natural environment can sort of take this industrialized process for a sustained period of time. It could just be too exhaustive on the resources of the planet and putting too much toxins back into the planet in order to be sustainable. So that's certainly something that we're sort of still trying to figure out if and where we're going to be going with the entire idea of industrialization and how long it's actually going to be possible for. Also, another big kind of con is that it does not benefit all people equally, right? You're still going to have sort of your have and your have-nots, and while you are still going to be getting sort of the emergence of this sort of middle class, it's generally going to make things worse for the poorer classes, where they're essentially, because they are not going to be able to sustain themselves through agriculture as easily as they once have been able to. The land is being bought up oftentimes through this process of industrialization. Industrialized farming means that if you can't sort of purchase the industrial equipment in order to be competitive, you're not going to be able to sustain yourself that way. So more and more people are being essentially forced into these low wage, and we'll be talking about in a moment, not real pleasant jobs with very little option a lot of times because food's available. They can still support the population, but increasingly it's going to be a larger and larger population that aren't living all that well. The cities are going to be, sort of overflowing with people. The infrastructure of those cities isn't going to be keeping up very well, so the cities are going to become very sort of disgusting places where there's sort of sewage flowing in the streets. And until there's actually some devotion to some huge infrastructure changes, which occurs in all these industrialized countries at some point in time or another, it's going to be pretty unhealthy a lot of times to be in some of these cities where the infrastructure just hasn't kept up with the population. Also, it's like I said, it leads to this very much this sort of separation of classes based now on wealth, not just land ownership, not just sort of status, but wealth increasingly is going to become the way that status is passed on. But it's also going to mean that it's much easier to keep wealth within a particular class, or at least that's how it's going to be operating. It becomes very monopolistic, where the people who are able to make a lot of money want to make sure that they're the only ones making money, want to try to drive other people out of the business. So this is where you get people like Rockefeller and the Carnegies and these sort of huge monumental business owners that, while they're very successful themselves, want to make sure that they are going to be the primary ones benefiting. And more often than not, that success and that money is not going to be shared across an industry, and it's not going to be shared with the people who are actually oftentimes working in the factories or underneath the people who are sort of owning these large businesses. It also very much led to poor and dangerous working conditions. Working in areas that you could get your fingers crushed or chopped off. You could lose your limbs. You could be working with chemicals that might be really toxic, and either the owners don't know or they don't care. So it can lead to some very unhealthy, unsafe working conditions that essentially, if you're more or less forced to work in one of these locations in order to have just enough to sort of barely scrape by to eat, it's going to put you in a very precarious position. Oftentimes, these jobs were 16-hour days, 14-hour days, working 7 days a week, very few breaks. You really got the sense of sort of what this life was like from the Stadler Committee report, right? And listening to Elizabeth Bentley give her account in the primary source document. And that's another kind of aspect to bring up here, child labor, right? That was also something that was very prevalent at this point in time. It's important to note that a lot of these negatives are still occurring in some locations around the world today. This hasn't been entirely eradicated, and that's sort of one of the big, sort of downsides. Like I said, there's the people who benefit from it and the people who don't. But increasingly, it's seen by the people who are benefiting that they benefit more by making sure that they're paying wages as low as possible. And this is possible when essentially there's a very large group or class that is at kind of living in that sort of area of sort of just barely subsisting or in poverty. Because if essentially someone says, I don't want to work here because you're not paying me enough, the owners can just say, fine, there's 10 people outside the door waiting to take your place. That's the way the owners of these companies oftentimes wanted things. They wanted to barely pay enough for people to live and make sure that there was a lot of people who weren't even getting that ready to take those jobs if they became available. So it led oftentimes to a very sort of unstable social situation, which we'll be talking about more in the next question.